Welcome to Order Before Modern Systems. Here, we explore how everyday order functioned before modern systems, institutions, and formal rules existed. This channel examines how routine, habit, and shared expectations shaped daily life long before modern organization took form. Order without written rules. When people picture law, they often picture books, courts, police uniforms, and official rules printed on paper. But, for most of human history, many communities did not rely on a large body of written law. Some had no writing at all. Others had writing, but still handled many daily conflicts through memory, custom, and local practice. Yet these societies were not automatically chaotic. People still worked, traded, raised children, shared land and water, settled arguments, and punished harmful behavior. They did it with systems that were often older than written codes. These systems were not no rules. They were rules that lived in people's minds and in community habits. This documentary explains how order could exist without written rules. It looks at the main building blocks of non-written order: shared expectations, reputation, kinship duties, community enforcement, compensation, oaths, councils of elders, and early local courts. It also explains why societies later turned more toward written law, and what written rules changed. First, it helps to be clear about what without written rules means. In many places there were rules, but they were not organized as a single written law book for everyone. People learned the rules by watching older people, hearing local decisions, and being corrected when they stepped out of line. In some societies, special people memorized long sets of customs. In others, local leaders and councils remembered past outcomes and tried to keep decisions consistent. So the question is not whether rules existed. The question is how rules were created, remembered, enforced, and accepted when they were not written down in a modern style. One of the most important sources of order was custom. Custom is a pattern of behavior that a community repeats over time until people treat it as the proper way to act. It can cover almost everything: how land is shared, how debts are repaid, what counts as an insult, what happens after theft, how marriage works, and who speaks for a household. Custom works because it is familiar. People do not have to read it. They grow up inside it. In small communities, this can be very powerful. If everyone knows the same basic expectations, then many problems never grow into full conflicts. Custom also works because it creates predictability. If people believe that a certain kind of harm usually leads to a certain kind of response, they can plan their behavior and avoid needless risk. But custom is not perfect. It can be unclear, especially when new situations appear. It can also favor powerful families, and it can vary from one village to the next. That is one reason why later states wanted more written, centralized rules. Another key source of order was reputation. In small-scale communities, reputation is like a social record. People remember who pays their debts, who helps in hard times, who steals, who lies, who starts fights, and who can be trusted. Reputation matters because people depend on each other. If you need neighbors to help harvest crops, build a roof, watch animals, protect paths, or stand with you in a dispute, then you cannot afford to become known as unreliable or dangerous. Reputation also matters because many early justice systems relied on people's sworn statements. In a world with few written contracts and limited physical evidence, the community's belief about a person's character could shape outcomes. A known troublemaker could find it harder to gain support. A respected person could find it easier to gather allies. Because reputation was so important, social pressure became a form of enforcement. This pressure could be mild, like criticism and gossip. It could also be serious, like refusal to trade, refusal to marry into a family, or exclusion from shared work and shared resources. The strongest version is social shunning. sometimes called ostracism, in certain historical settings. Ostracism, in its general meaning, is the practice of pushing someone out of the normal social circle. It is a punishment that does not require prisons or professional police. It works because isolation is costly. A person who is cut off may lose protection, labor partners, and access to community resources. A third foundation of order was kinship responsibility. In many societies, the basic unit was not just the individual. It was the family, the household, and the wider kin group. A person's actions could bring trouble or shame to relatives. Relatives could also be required to help pay compensation or to answer for a member's behavior. This creates two effects. First, it spreads risk. If a person causes harm, the injured side may demand compensation from the offender's group, not just the offender alone. That makes it more likely that the injured side receives something, and it makes retaliation less likely. Second, it creates internal control. If a person's behavior could trigger a feud or serious payments, relatives have a reason to stop that person early. They may pressure them to settle disputes, avoid fights, or accept mediation. This idea appears in several historical systems where compensation could replace revenge. One well-known example is the Germanic and early medieval practice often described as Wehrgild, meaning a man payment. The basic idea is that if someone injures or kills another person, the offender's side can pay a set amount to the victim or the victim's kin group. In theory, once proper payment is made, the feud should end. Compensation systems like this are often misunderstood. They were not simply buying forgiveness in a modern emotional sense. They were a practical tool in communities where violence between families could spiral. Compensation gave a structured way to stop the cycle and restore peace. Compensation also turned private revenge into something closer to a public standard. Even before strong states, communities could treat certain harms as having a known price, often adjusted by social status, the seriousness of the injury, and sometimes the setting in which it happened. But compensation systems had limits. If one side refused the payment or believed the payment was too low, violence could still continue. Also, if a powerful person could avoid payment, the system could fail. Over time, growing states often tried to pull violence control away from families and into official institutions. A fourth foundation of order was the community's ability to gather and decide. Long before modern courts, many societies had councils, assemblies, and local meetings. These could be meetings of elders, meetings of household heads, or gatherings of free members of the community. These bodies did several jobs. They helped identify what happened in a dispute. They helped decide what the normal response should be. They helped pressure both sides toward settlement. They also protected the community as a whole by limiting endless private fighting. Even when decisions were not written down, people could still remember them. Past decisions became examples. Over time, those examples became the way we handle this. That is one way custom grows. These local gatherings were also important because early communities often cared as much about restoring working relationships as about punishment. In a small village, people cannot easily avoid each other. They share paths, water, grazing areas, and tools. So justice often aimed to restore order so daily life could continue. That does not mean it was gentle. Many systems had harsh penalties for repeated harm, for betrayal, or for crimes that threatened survival. But the basic goal was often stability. A fifth foundation was the use of oaths, sureties, and group responsibility. In many historical legal cultures, a sworn oath was treated as a serious act. This made sense in societies where written proof was limited and where religion or shared belief made oath-breaking dangerous to one's standing. Some systems used oath helpers, sometimes called compurgation. In this method, An accused person could defend themselves by swearing an oath, and bringing a certain number of people who would swear that they believed the accused's oath was truthful. To modernize, this can look like people simply voting for a friend. But in a tightly connected community, it carried risk. If the accused later proved dishonest, the oath helpers could be blamed for supporting them. And people were cautious about tying their name to a known liar. This method also shows how justice could rely on social knowledge. Neighbors knew each other's habits. The community's memory became a form of evidence. Another method was surety, meaning someone took responsibility for another person's appearance in a dispute or for their future behavior. In medieval England, a later and more organized form of group surety developed in the system often called francablage. Under this kind of arrangement, groups of men were responsible for producing members of their group when required. If a person fled, the group could face fines. This model did not require a large professional police force. It used the community itself as the enforcement mechanism. Along similar lines, many places used a duty to respond when crime was witnessed. In medieval English practice, a concept known as hue and cry required witnesses and neighbors to raise an alarm and pursue a suspected criminal from place to place. The assumption was that public safety was a shared responsibility. This also connects to the broader idea that officials could call on ordinary people to help enforce the peace. In later legal language, a sheriff could summon the power of the county, sometimes described as a posse. These systems show a major pattern. Before modern policing, enforcement often depended on local participation. That participation was not always voluntary in the modern sense. It was often treated as a duty. A sixth foundation of order was structured local courts and small officials, even when law was mostly custom. It is easy to imagine a sharp line between no government and modern government, but many societies existed in between. In medieval Europe, for example, there were manorial courts where a lord's representative and local officers handled many disputes among tenants. These courts dealt with land transfers, minor offences, and local order. They also collected fines. Even when customs were later written down in documents called custumals, those documents often recorded what people already treated as established practice. This points to an important idea. Writing often comes after the rule. A custom can exist for generations before someone decides to record it. The act of writing may strengthen the custom, but it may not create it. Now consider how investigation worked before modern detectives. Today, investigation often means collecting physical evidence, using forensics, and building a case through trained professionals. In many earlier settings, investigation was more limited, but not absent. It used tools that fit the world. First, immediate community knowledge. If something happened in a small place, people noticed. They knew who had conflicts, who had debts, who was missing, and who suddenly had new goods. Second, witness testimony. If someone saw the event, their statement mattered greatly. Third, tracking and pursuit. Communities could organize searches, especially when a suspect fled. Fourth, confession. Some systems, confession could be central, sometimes encouraged by social pressure or religious authority. Fifth, ordeal in certain times and places. Some societies use practices like trial by ordeal, where the outcome was believed to show divine judgment. These methods were not universal, and they changed over time. Where they existed, they were a way to reach a decision when human proof seemed uncertain. Sixth, reputation and patterns. A person known for repeated harm could be treated differently than a person with a strong standing. These methods often aimed at reaching a decision that the community would accept. Acceptance mattered because enforcement depended on cooperation. If a decision was viewed as unfair, people might refuse to help enforce it, or they might retaliate privately. That brings us to punishment. Before modern prisons, punishment often took different forms. One major form was compensation. Instead of locking someone away, the system could force them to repay the victim. This has a practical side. It repairs harm in a world where labor and resources are limited. Another form was fines paid to an authority. As kings and lords grew stronger, many offences were treated not only as harm to a victim, but also as a breach of public peace. This allowed authorities to collect payments and to claim a role in controlling violence. Another form was public shame. Shame punishments could include public apology, ritual acts, or exposure before the community. These punishments used reputation as the pain. Another form was exclusion. A person could be declared outside normal protection. In some systems, a person without legal protection could be harmed without the usual consequences, or could be denied community support. This is an extreme sanction that does not require prisons, but it can be severe. Another form was physical punishment. In many times and places, physical punishment and even execution existed for certain offences. These punishments could be tied to ideas of deterrence, public safety, or authority. They could also be used unfairly, especially against the powerless. So far, these systems may sound stable, but they had built-in tensions. Non-written systems often work best in smaller, close-knit communities where most people know each other. Reputation travels fast. The community can gather quickly. Shared beliefs support oaths. People have long-term relationships. As societies grow larger and more complex, problems appear. First, strangers become common. When trade increases and towns grow, people deal with others outside their kin group and outside their village. Reputation is harder to track. People can move away more easily. Second, disputes become more technical. Property, contracts, shipping, and large-scale finance create conflicts that are harder to solve by memory and local custom alone. Third, power becomes more centralized. Kings, states, and empires want predictable control over taxes, land, and public order. They often dislike local variation. Fourth, local systems can be captured by local elites. If a small group controls decisions, they can shape custom to fit their interests. Fifth, violence can still spiral. Compensation systems can fail when groups refuse to settle, when honor demands retaliation, or when wealth differences make payments unequal. These pressures push societies toward written law, professional courts, and professional enforcement. But written law does not erase custom. Even after written codes appear, daily life often continues to be guided by habits. Written law may handle major issues, while local practice still fills the gaps. It is also important to understand that written law does not automatically mean fairness. A written rule can be clear, but still unjust. A written system can still be biased. Writing helps standardize and preserve rules, but it does not guarantee good outcomes. So what is the main lesson about order without written rules? Order does not begin with paperwork. It begins with shared expectations and shared enforcement. When people accept a basic set of norms and when there are agreed ways to respond to violations, a community can maintain stability even without written law. Those ways often include custom, learned through everyday life; reputation, maintained through social memory; kinship duties, spreading responsibility and control; assemblies and councils, providing decisions the community can accept; oaths and sureties, creating social proof when physical evidence is limited; community participation in enforcement, like pursuit and collective responsibility; compensation and settlement, reducing cycles of revenge; local courts and officials, even when rules are mostly customary. At the same time, these systems have limits. They can struggle with strangers, large populations, and complex economies. They can favor the powerful. They can fail when trust breaks down. They can rely too heavily on social pressure, which can punish the unpopular even when they are not guilty. Modern law enforcement and written legal systems grew partly as an answer to these limits. They offered a promise of standardized rules, formal proof, and public authority. But the older systems reveal something basic about human societies. People create order not only through government, but through shared habits, shared duties, and shared responses to harm. Written rules are one tool among many. In much of history, order was not maintained by a distant institution. It was maintained by the community itself, through customs that everyone understood, and through enforcement that everyone was expected to support. That is how order could exist without written rules, not because rules were absent, but because rules lived in practice, memory, and social responsibility.